When a person disappears near an international border, investigators have to consider every realistic possibility, even the ones that seem unlikely at first. That has been true from the beginning of the Nancy Guthrie case. But one question has quietly resurfaced in recent weeks, and it's one that hasn't received nearly as much attention as many people expected. Could someone have used the vast Native American reservation that stretches between Tucson and the Mexican border to move Nancy into Mexico without going through a traditional border crossing? It's an uncomfortable question, and right now there is no public evidence proving that it happened. Mexican authorities have repeatedly said they have found no evidence that Nancy was taken into Mexico. The FBI has never publicly confirmed that Mexico is a primary focus of the investigation. Even so, experienced investigators say it would be difficult to completely rule out the possibility because of the geography surrounding Tucson and the sheer size of the area involved. Hello everyone, and welcome back. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with me. If you enjoy thoughtful, fact-based discussions about ongoing investigations, I hope you'll consider subscribing. It really helps the channel, and I'm grateful to everyone who continues to support these conversations. To understand why this question keeps coming up, we have to go back to where this investigation began. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home in Tucson, Arizona. According to investigators, someone approached her residence during the early morning hours. Surveillance footage captured an unknown individual outside the home, but many questions remain unanswered. Authorities have released only limited information about what happened after that, leaving investigators, reporters, and the public trying to understand what may have unfolded. Almost immediately, people focused on Tucson's location. If you've never been there, it's difficult to appreciate just how close southern Arizona sits to the Mexican border. On a map, the distance may not seem extraordinary, but seeing the landscape in person tells a very different story. Long stretches of desert extend in every direction. Mountains rise in the distance. Dirt roads branch off into areas where you can drive for miles without seeing another vehicle. That geography has always made border security a complex challenge. Most people picture busy ports of entry like Nogales, where traffic moves through inspection stations, cameras monitor vehicles, and Border Patrol officers are visible throughout the day. But long-time law enforcement officers say that isn't the entire picture. Southern Arizona contains thousands of square miles of rugged terrain, and much of it has been the subject of federal enforcement efforts for decades. One area, in particular, stands out on the map. The Tohono O'odham Nation covers an enormous section of southern Arizona, stretching across desert land that reaches all the way to the international border. Parts of the nation even extend into Mexico, making it unlike almost any other region along the border. For years, federal agencies have worked alongside tribal law enforcement to monitor illegal crossings, drug trafficking routes, and other criminal activity. The reservation is respected as sovereign tribal land, with its own police department and government, while federal agencies also maintain investigative authority in certain situations. At first, that seemed like little more than background information. Then, something unexpected happened. A volunteer search organization in Mexico reported receiving an anonymous tip claiming Nancy might be buried near the border. According to Mexican officials, a search was conducted, but nothing was found that supported the information. Authorities publicly stated there was no verified evidence connecting Nancy to that location. For many observers, that should have ended the discussion. Instead, it sparked another question. If someone wanted investigators to believe Nancy had been taken into Mexico, how would they have gotten there? That question led experienced investigators to look once again at the terrain between Tucson and the border. Retired FBI personnel familiar with the region have explained that investigators cannot ignore any reasonable possibility during an active missing person investigation. They also caution against jumping to conclusions without evidence. Simply because a route exists does not mean it was used. Still, They acknowledge something important. The reservation has to be considered as part of the overall investigative picture because of where it sits geographically. Imagine standing in southern Arizona just after sunrise. The desert air is already warming. Saguaro cacti cast long shadows across open ground. Dirt roads disappear toward distant hills. In many places, there are no houses, no businesses, and very little traffic. That isolation makes the landscape difficult to search. It also means investigators have to think carefully about every possible route someone could have taken, whether that route ultimately proves relevant or not. According to former investigators familiar with border operations, simply driving across the reservation into Mexico would not necessarily be easy. Modern surveillance technology covers significant portions of the border. Cameras monitor activity in many locations. Sensors, aircraft, and Border Patrol resources operate throughout the region. Smuggling organizations often avoid obvious vehicle crossings because they know those areas receive attention. In other words, the picture is far more complicated than simply finding an isolated road on a map. There is another factor that investigators have discussed quietly for months. If Nancy had been moved any significant distance after leaving her home, a vehicle almost certainly would have been involved. That makes identifying any possible vehicle one of the most valuable pieces of evidence investigators could obtain. Without that information, reviewing countless hours of border surveillance becomes far more difficult. Investigators may have video from various locations, but unless they know what they're looking for, thousands of vehicles could pass through the frame during a single day. That brings us to another important question. If experienced investigators believe the reservation should at least be considered, what do law enforcement officers, who actually spent decades working that landscape, think about the practical realities of moving someone through it? Their answers paint a picture that is both more complicated and more revealing than many people realize. When former investigators began discussing the reservation, they weren't suggesting that Nancy Guthrie was definitely taken through it. They were making a different point altogether. In an investigation like this, geography matters. Every realistic route has to be examined, especially when investigators are trying to understand what could have happened during the critical hours after someone disappears. That would have been the end of it if the reservation looked like an ordinary suburban neighborhood. But it doesn't. Retired law enforcement officers who spent decades working southern Arizona describe the area as one of the most unique landscapes in the country. Vast stretches of open desert are broken only by rugged mountain ranges, dry riverbeds, and miles of dirt roads that weave through the terrain. During daylight, the scenery is striking. At night, it becomes an entirely different world. The darkness can be almost complete. Away from Tucson and the highways, there are places where the only light comes from the stars overhead. Experienced officers say that's one reason smugglers have used parts of southern Arizona for years. Not because the area is completely unprotected, but because covering every square mile around the clock is an enormous challenge. According to retired FBI personnel familiar with border investigations, federal agencies have invested heavily in technology. Cameras monitor portions of the border. Motion sensors alert agents to movement. Aircraft patrol from above. Helicopters equipped with night vision routinely fly the region. In other words, crossing illegally is far from simple. That may surprise people who assume someone could simply drive across the desert unnoticed. Former investigators caution that vehicles often attract attention more quickly than people on foot. Dust trails can be visible from long distances. Tire tracks can remain in the desert. A single, unfamiliar vehicle traveling through isolated areas may stand out to residents who know the region well. That detail is important. The Tohono O'odham Nation is not an empty piece of land. Families live there. Tribal police patrol the reservation. Residents often recognize vehicles that belong in the community and notice those that don't. One retired FBI agent explained that if strangers suddenly appeared in a remote part of the reservation, there is a good chance someone would remember seeing them. While the landscape is enormous, local knowledge can be just as valuable as surveillance cameras. At first, that seems to make the reservation a difficult place to move unnoticed. Then, another factor enters the discussion. Former Pima County investigators point out that the reservation contains numerous roads, washes, and remote access routes that have been used for decades by smugglers transporting drugs and migrants. Border Patrol is well aware of those routes, and many have become the focus of ongoing enforcement operations. But officers also acknowledge a simple reality. No law enforcement agency has unlimited resources. Thousands of square miles cannot all be watched at exactly the same moment. That is why investigators refuse to dismiss possibilities based solely on assumptions. According to retired members of law enforcement, if investigators had developed credible evidence suggesting Nancy had been transported toward the border, the reservation would almost certainly become one area requiring close examination. That doesn't mean they would immediately begin massive searches. Instead, they would look for supporting evidence. Did surveillance cameras capture a vehicle? Did license plate readers detect anything unusual? Did anyone report seeing unfamiliar people? Were there phone records placing someone in the area? Each answer would either strengthen or weaken the theory. Without evidence, experienced investigators say the reservation remains just one possibility among many. Another issue keeps coming up whenever former investigators discuss this case. The vehicle. Again and again, retired FBI agents and local detectives emphasize that identifying the right vehicle could answer multiple questions at once. Imagine investigators determine the make, model, or color of the vehicle involved. Suddenly, traffic cameras become much more useful. Border crossing footage can be reviewed with a specific target in mind. Private security cameras along highways may become more valuable. Witnesses who previously overlooked an ordinary vehicle may suddenly remember seeing it parked in an unusual place. Without that information, however, investigators are searching through an enormous amount of data. That is one reason many experts believe authorities have been careful about releasing information publicly. If investigators have several possible vehicles under review but haven't confirmed which one is connected to the case, announcing those details too early could create confusion. Thousands of tips might pour in about innocent drivers who simply happen to own similar vehicles. According to retired investigators, protecting sensitive evidence is often just as important as collecting it. Then something else caught the attention of investigators following the case. Mexican authorities continued to publicly state that they had found no evidence placing Nancy inside Mexico. Some people interpreted those statements as proof the case had nothing to do with Mexico at all. Former investigators urge caution before making that assumption. Officials can only speak about the evidence they currently possess. Saying there is no verified evidence is very different from saying something is impossible. Likewise, investigators inside the United States have repeatedly said they continue to follow up on credible leads wherever those leads may take them. That balanced approach reflects how experienced detectives typically work. They avoid locking themselves into one theory too early. They also avoid eliminating possibilities until evidence allows them to do so confidently. As weeks turned into months, frustration naturally began to grow. Family members continued searching for answers. Neighbors wondered whether someone had seen something important without realizing it. Investigators kept reviewing evidence behind the scenes, knowing that one overlooked detail, a witness, a vehicle, a digital record, or a surveillance image, could eventually connect multiple pieces of the puzzle. Former detectives often describe investigations like this as assembling a jigsaw puzzle without knowing whether every piece is even on the table. Some days produce major breakthroughs. Other days involve reviewing the same evidence again, hoping something new becomes visible with fresh eyes. That brings us to another development many people hadn't considered. Even if Nancy never crossed into Mexico, investigators say the changing seasons in southern Arizona could dramatically affect any search taking place in the desert. Heavy summer monsoon rains have the potential to erase evidence, reshape washes, and even move objects significant distances across the landscape. For investigators, that creates an entirely new set of challenges, and it raises another question that deserves a closer look. As investigators continue working through every lead, one thing has become increasingly clear. The question isn't simply whether Nancy Guthrie could have been taken through the Tohono O'odham Nation into Mexico. The real question is whether there is evidence pointing investigators in that direction. So far, publicly available information doesn't answer that question. Authorities on both sides of the border have consistently urged caution. Mexican officials have stated that searches connected to anonymous tips have not produced verified evidence placing Nancy inside Mexico. At the same time, investigators in Arizona have emphasized that the case remains active and that every credible lead continues to be evaluated. That approach may not satisfy everyone hoping for immediate answers, but experienced detectives say it is exactly how major investigations are supposed to work. Investigators rarely eliminate possibilities simply because they appear unlikely. They follow evidence, not assumptions. Another factor now weighs heavily on those familiar with southern Arizona: the weather. Anyone who has visited Tucson during the summer knows how dramatically the landscape can change. Weeks of dry heat can suddenly give way to powerful monsoon storms. Thick clouds roll over the mountains during the afternoon. Within minutes, heavy rain begins falling across the desert. Dry washes that looked harmless just hours earlier become fast-moving streams. Roads disappear beneath rushing water. Loose sand is carried away. Tree branches, rocks, and debris are pushed for miles. Former investigators say these storms create enormous challenges during outdoor searches. Even small pieces of evidence can disappear. Footprints vanish. Tire tracks soften and eventually wash away. Lightweight objects may be carried downstream before anyone ever discovers them. If investigators have already identified specific locations they want to search, many try to examine those areas before the strongest monsoon activity arrives. That doesn't mean valuable evidence cannot still be found afterward. It simply means nature becomes another obstacle. Former detectives also point out something that many people outside Arizona may not realize. The desert is far from empty. Wildlife, weather, and time constantly change the landscape. A location photographed in February may look noticeably different by July. Floodwater can carve new channels through the soil. Vegetation begins growing after rainfall. Familiar landmarks sometimes appear completely different only a few months later. Those changing conditions help explain why large-scale searches require careful planning. Investigators don't simply choose random locations. They rely on witness statements, digital evidence, cell phone records, surveillance footage, vehicle information. Every piece helps narrow the search area. Without those clues, searching thousands of square miles becomes almost impossible. That is why so many former investigators continue returning to one critical issue: the unknown vehicle. If authorities eventually determine exactly which vehicle was used, many other questions become easier to answer. Did it travel south? Did it remain inside Arizona? Did cameras capture it near the border? Did it appear near the reservation? Those answers could dramatically reshape the investigation. Until then, investigators are working with information the public has not seen. That is another important reminder. While many people understandably become frustrated by the lack of public updates, experienced detectives often explain that silence does not necessarily mean inactivity. Some investigations appear quiet for months before one new piece of evidence suddenly connects dozens of earlier clues. That has happened in many well-known criminal cases across the country. An overlooked surveillance image, a forgotten witness, a new forensic examination, a digital record recovered months later. Sometimes, investigators revisit evidence multiple times before recognizing its importance. According to retired investigators familiar with cases like this, patience is often one of the most difficult parts of the job. Families want answers. Communities want reassurance. Reporters want updates. Investigators want results. But none of those goals can come at the expense of protecting the integrity of the investigation. Looking back over everything we've discussed today, one conclusion stands out. The Native American reservation should not be viewed as proof of anything, nor should it be dismissed simply because it sounds unlikely. Its location makes it a reasonable area for investigators to consider as they evaluate every possible route that may have existed after Nancy disappeared. That is very different from saying investigators believe Nancy was taken there. Those are two completely different statements. Right now, the publicly available evidence does not establish that Nancy entered Mexico. It also does not explain exactly what happened after she disappeared from her Tucson home. Those unanswered questions are precisely why this investigation remains so important. Somewhere, someone may remember a vehicle parked where it shouldn't have been. Someone may recall an unusual conversation that didn't seem important at the time. A surveillance camera may contain an image investigators have not yet connected to the timeline. Even the smallest detail can become significant when viewed alongside new evidence. History has shown that many long-running investigations are eventually solved because one person came forward with information they initially believed was insignificant. As difficult as the waiting has been, investigators continue encouraging anyone with credible information to report it, no matter how minor it may seem. For Nancy's family, every day without answers is another day filled with uncertainty. That is perhaps the hardest part of all. Beyond the headlines, beyond the interviews, and beyond the theories, there is a family still hoping for clarity and still waiting to learn exactly what happened. As always, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Based on the publicly available information, do you think investigators are right to keep every possible route under consideration, including the reservation and the possibility of Mexico? Or do you believe the evidence points in a completely different direction? Let me know your perspective in the comments below. If you found this discussion thoughtful and informative, thank you for spending your time here today. Your support truly means a great deal. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing so you won't miss future updates as new information becomes available. Until next time, thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again soon.